Welcome to the Center for Applied Research on Targeted Violence. Our guests today are Maggie Feinstein, Executive Director of the 1027 Healing Partnership, and Martin Gaynor, Lester A. Hamburg, University Professor of Public Policy and Economics at Carnegie Mellon University. He's also the former director of the Bureau of Economics at the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. Martin, thank you for being here and for your willingness to share your story about that tragic day. You're a Carnegie Mellon University professor, and as we know, this campus resides less than a mile from where the tragedy occurred. Tell us about that morning on October 27th, 2018.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I've been here at Carnegie Mellon almost 30 years and really feel very fortunate to be a part of this community. As far as that day goes, it was a perfectly normal day until it wasn't. I had been in Portland, Maine for a couple days at a professional meeting, and I'd been there with people I'd known for a long time, and it had been a very pleasant, gratifying few days. And then I came back on the afternoon of the 26th, the Friday, and I got back in time for Shabbos, in time for the Jewish Sabbath. It was important to get back before it was dark, because that's when the Sabbath starts. And all that went very smoothly. As you know, sometimes travel does not. And then I got up the next morning and I went to synagogue, and it was a typical fall Pittsburgh day, meaning gray, overcast, drizzling a little bit. And I was walking up Wilkins Avenue to the synagogue, and I was feeling good. I went through the door. I was greeted by Cecil Rosenthal of blessed memory, who liked to sit at the front door and greet people and wish them a good Shabbos, a good Sabbath. And Joe Charney and Audrey Glickman and Dan Legger came in behind me. Now, one thing is that building, the Tree of Life Synagogue building, was the building for the Tree of Life congregation. But at that time, there were two other congregations using the building as well. Dor Chadash, I was a member of Dor Chadash at that time, and New Light congregation, all in different spaces, although not far from one another. So Joe and Audrey were members of Tree of Life congregation. They went off in their direction. Dan Legger and I were members of Dor Chadash, so we went to where we were, and we were setting up the room for the services. Services started at, we're supposed to start at 10. People show up, and nobody, very few people actually show up on time. You need 10 people to hold a service, to hold a Jewish service. And so we would wait till we had 10 people. Anyhow, Dan came in shortly after me, and we're getting out prayer books and books that had the readings from the Torah that we would do that day, and getting things arranged. And then Jerry Rabinowitz, blessed memory, another Dor Chadash member, came in, and we got all the stuff set up. There was time. We were sitting around and talking and telling silly jokes and just kidding around. Everybody was relaxed and feeling good. And then, well, I can't say we heard what I heard, but what I heard later from Dan is, I think his recollections are similar to mine. I heard what sounded like something large and heavy and metallic falling. It was a loud sound, kind of like a crash. And there are these very old coat racks out in the hall. They're all made of metal. And they're clearly very heavy. It actually wouldn't be that easy to knock one over. But what it sounded like to me is like one of those had fallen over. And there are a lot of older people at these services. And so I got worried, well, what happened? Maybe it fell over on top of somebody or something, and maybe one of these people would need some help. And Jerry and Dan and I looked at each other, and we were in a separate room to go out into the hall to look and see if somebody needed some help. And then I heard another sound. It sounded like, again, something very large and heavy falling over. This time it sounded more like something solid, not like something metal. So we went out into the hall. First it was Jerry, then Dan, and then me, and we started down the hall. And at that point, I heard gunshots. I clearly recognized the sounds as gunfire from a powerful firearm, not from a small weapon. I have shotguns. I don't own a gun, but I have shotguns. I have some familiarity with the sound of a weapon being fired, and it was clearly a very powerful firearm. So I heard that, and then without thinking, I turned around and ran the other way. We were in a long hall, and we were heading in one direction toward the sound, as it turned out, of gunfire. And then the hall went down the other way, and there's an exit the other way that exits out onto Wilkins Avenue, out onto the street. So I literally didn't think. It was not a conscious act. I turned around and I ran the other way, and then I got to a set of doors that led to the outside. And I do recall thinking in the moment, I don't know if there are people outside who are also attacking, but if I stay inside, I very well may be shot. So I just burst through the doors, and I figured, well, I'll just see what happens. And I got through the doors, and then I ran down Wilkins Avenue. There's a traffic light at Wilkins and Shady, and there was some traffic, but I just ran across the street. I think it's the fastest I may have ever run in my life. And I got down to, I was thinking I have to get out of sight because I don't know who's there, what's going on. And if I'm visible, someone may shoot me. And I also felt I needed to call 911. At that time, I did not carry my phone on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to use electronic devices on the Sabbath. So I didn't have a phone with me. The next side street is Denniston. And I said, I'll just get down the side street and then I'll get out of sight and figure out something. As it so happened, the moment I got to that side street and turned the corner, a car came the other direction up Wilkins and turned the corner and parked in front of a house right on the corner. And a woman and a teenage boy got out. And I went over to the woman and I asked her to call 911. Well, she gave me her phone and I called 911. And then she invited me to come into the house with them, which I did. It seemed like a good idea at the time. At the time, I felt like, well, I was hiding because, like I said, I didn't know what was going on. Now, one thing I'll mention, I'll backtrack just a minute. I don't recall how long before that, but I'll say a couple years before 10/27/18, I had done a training course that the Carnegie Mellon Police Department had put on for active shooter. And I am convinced that that training saved my life because you're taught run, hide, fight. And it wasn't a super long course, but they did train the people that were attending. And as I said, in the moment when that was happening, I just reacted. It was not conscious thought. It just happened. And I feel if I hadn't had that course, I probably would not have reacted in the way that I did. And what happened was my two friends, Jerry Rabinowitz of blessed memory and Dan Legger, kept going in the original direction. They were both shot. Jerry tragically was murdered that day, and Dan was wounded very, very severely. Thank God he survived and recovered and is with us today. I discovered later, I think it wasn't until a day or so later, that I had a small piece of shrapnel in my elbow, very small. I hadn't noticed it at all at the time. So anyhow, it was clearly a very, very close call, a matter of seconds or less. So that training was absolutely essential. And I do know there are other survivors of that day who have had training in different locations who also feel that that training saved their life. So that's what happened that day. I'm extraordinarily grateful to have survived. It's, like I said, a very close thing indeed, but I'll take it.
Yes. And Marty, I'm so glad you took that training as well. Yes. I'd like to now turn to Maggie. Maggie, tell us about the 1027 Healing Partnership. Your work is so important and has really, I think, done a tremendous service for the community after that tragic event.
Yeah. So the 1027 Healing Partnership was created to support the community in the healing journey following such a terrible incident. And we are created under a grant that comes from the federal government called the Anti-Terrorism Emergency Assistance Program. And that grant recognizes that the impacts of mass violence, and especially hate-motivated mass violence, require different types of support for the victims and the indirect victims and then the community that surrounds them. And so hearing, Marty share his really painful and also happy because I get to sit next to him and get to know him, but painful story in thinking about it through one person's lens, that the 1027 Healing Partnership tries to learn sort of the many lenses, realizing that in the moment that he thought that, that he was sort of doing what he needed to do, that so many people were doing what they needed to do, and then the community was trying to figure out which end was up. And so over the last 6 years, we have been really blessed to be able to be in a place of learning the stories of the 11. I think that everybody who has an opportunity to learn about the 11 people who were murdered, the people who come early, who do things that are unrecognized in any house of worship, there's always those people. And all of the 11 were those people. And then all of the survivors continue to tell the story of what that selflessness looks like, what community care looks like, what being a person who believes in being part of a community looks like. So in the ensuing years, being able to learn about and elevate the stories of those 11 people as well as the survivors as a path towards both understanding the terrible implications of hate speech and violence, but also understanding the beauty of continuing our communities, our religious communities, seeing them as a source of resilience, and investing in that has been the work that we've been doing.
Marty, how are you doing 7 years after the event?
I'm doing great. I am grateful for every single day. I've always been grateful for every single day. There's a Jewish practice where every morning we wake up, literally as soon as we open our eyes, we recite a very brief prayer giving thanks to God that we're here. That's it. It's one line. And that's something that I did prior to that event, but became even more meaningful after the event. And I feel that very strongly. I think if this awful thing had never happened, or if it hadn't happened to me, I would still be grateful to be here, but it feels particularly so. This whole thing is so funny. It's such a strange experience in many ways. You never think it will happen to you. You never think it'll happen to you. You read about it in the papers, you hear about it on the radio, on television, it's other people, and you feel awful for those people, absolutely awful, but you never think it will happen to you. But guess what? Sometimes it is you. And of course, with the epidemic, I don't think there's any other word for it, of gun violence in our country, it's increasingly happening to people. The number of people who can say it didn't happen to them and it's never happened to anyone they know has become smaller and smaller and smaller. But as far as getting from where I was initially, which was extremely traumatized, very, very difficult situation, very dark place, to where I am now, I'll say that there have been a number of things that have happened as a result of this, in spite of the fact that what happened was beyond horrible. Things have happened that have actually been blessings. There are so many people that have come into my life, sometimes just for a very brief encounter or via a postcard or an email, and sometimes via a prolonged relationship. Maggie, you folks, many, many people that have been just tremendous blessings and not only have enriched my life, but have given me hope and strength and the ability to recover and continue. Personally, I feel that these people and these encounters were sent to us by God as a way of permitting us and helping us to recover, and as a way of bringing us comfort so we could get on with our lives. And that's important, not just so I and the other survivors and family members can live good and full lives, but so that the people who hate and the people who perpetrate hateful acts don't win. The person who did this didn't succeed at all. Horrifically, 11 innocent, defenseless, beautiful people were murdered in cold blood. But as soon as people were able, guess what? We were holding services. We were getting together. We were doing what we do. We were doing, because we were assaulted as Jews, we were doing what we do as Jews. And we were trying to make the world a better place so that it's a better place to live in. There's more love, less hate. And the probability that something horrible like this happens again is at least a little bit lower.
Maggie, how are the other survivors doing?
I mean, I think that, when it comes to trauma and healing, it's really a remarkable journey. And I think Marty actually just said it so beautifully, where it's this moment of the worst thing that could have ever happened, coupled with these learnings of what we are capable of. And, the constant reminder that everybody experiences trauma in their own unique way. There's not any way to sort of predict what anybody's trajectory might look like. But I think what is common is both the worst and some very beautiful things that come to people. It's just at different times. I think that what Marty was just saying, I was realizing that I have, in the last 6 years, gone to services led by every single one of the survivors from that day. I have been blessed to be in Shabbat services. And so to your question of how people are doing, I think to know that every single one of them is leading services, continuing to do the thing that they were doing that morning. And I am blessed by going and seeing that. So I think that, people are healing in the way that they heal, and people will continue healing. I don't believe in the word healed. There's no end to it. And so how are people doing is, they're humaning. They are experiencing the roller coaster that is what we're all set out to do on this world. And they're just experiencing it with this terrible and horrific moment that came and impacted their life, coupled with other moments. I think that when I talk about the community sort of as a group, there was, for me, probably the most inspiring thing that I'm assuming will ever happen in my life when I went through the trial accompanying the community of families and survivors. And I saw, in our justice system, this moment where our community was able to be exactly who they were, just superimposed into the legal system. They supported each other. They spoke truth about the incredible beauty of practicing Judaism, of being part of a community, of being proudly religious, proudly spiritual, but also proudly culturally connected to one another. I also saw the ways in which the justice system recognized anti-Semitism And I think everybody in our community has been impacted over the last few years about of what's going on locally with anti-Semitism. So there's sort of in the lows and highs of healing. The trial was a high in recognizing that there were supports, that the criminal justice system was able to name and recognize exactly what the intent was that day. And that gets coupled with painful places where neighbors don't, and where people have to cope with the fact that language is familiar and hate speech is still out there. So I think it's a complicated question always of how people are doing, but I do think that they're humaning incredibly well. And that is as much as any of us can do.
No one does this alone. Nobody's had to do this alone. Like I said, no one ever imagines it'll happen to them. Never in a million years did I think I would be a survivor of a violent anti-Semitic attack. It never occurred to me. And so, yeah, you have to dig deep individually, but you're not alone. I can't overstate the amount of support that I have received, and this is true for every one of the survivors and the family members, or for that matter, for community members as well. Maggie and the 1027 Healing Partnership, therapists, religious leaders. After the event, it was clear that people in Pittsburgh, not just the Jewish community, but everybody in Pittsburgh felt assaulted, felt violated. And not just that, but people all over the world. I got emails that very day, texts, phone calls from family members, obviously, but also from people I knew, some people I hadn't seen or heard of for years that contacted me over time. We got postcards like from a nun in Indiana, a painted rock from a kid in Alaska, things like that. It was just amazing. One of the things that really was a breakthrough for me in terms of recovery was this. Sometime in the week following, I eventually was able to go back to synagogue, not in the Tree of Life building, of course, but over at Beth Sholem, where morning prayers were being held. They always hold them, but people were going there. And I went there and I walked in order to say a prayer where you give thanks for surviving a dangerous situation. And Joe Charney, who had been in the building that day and had survived, was there leading the service. And I walked in the door and Joe's there. He's leading the service just like he always did. And Audrey Glickman was there, and I don't remember exactly, but some other folks were there. And that just helped me go from darkness to light, because here we are, we're doing what we do, and we are not intimidated. We are not prevented from doing these things. We keep on doing these things because this is who we are. And also I felt like, and I feel like we are honoring the memories of those people who were murdered. So that was really just an incredible moment for me. And then I kept going. I had not gone to that particular service on a weekday basis. I started going, and eventually Joe was no longer able to go, and then Joe died, may he rest in peace. At some point, I started leading the services now, and that is an incredibly, as a matter of fact, I led services there this morning. It's an incredibly meaningful thing to me.
Thank you for sharing that.
We call it post-traumatic growth. And that you're, when your eyes open up to something because of that horror and you see it differently. And I think about, all the ways that post-traumatic growth has come to the community is in each individual in different ways, but to sort of see yourself all of a sudden, see them, see yourself, and then all of a sudden wake up earlier to go be the leader, to make sure that service exists for the next person who can say a prayer for being thankful they're alive.
Yeah, 100%. And one thing Maggie and folks have done is help us in many ways, but also open our eyes to what this process is, and having some sense of what's going on, at least for me, is very helpful. Yeah, and post-traumatic growth, it's such an interesting thing. Who would think, right? Trauma is an awful thing. I would have said beforehand, well, this is crippling. how do you get past this? And actually, again, it's one of these sort of strange, ironic things. So good things have come out of this, and opportunities for growth have come out of this. Sometimes, there's been a horrible forest fire, and the place is devastated, and yet come the spring, flowers come out, trees start growing. Again, growth happens even in the aftermath of horrible destruction.
So, Martin, I'd like to switch gears and ask about the survivor's perspective of targeted violence and how that perspective can help those engaged in preventing targeted violence. And when I talk about targeted violence, I mean those involved, including law enforcement, government, nonprofit organizations, centers like ours. How can your perspective, survivor's perspective, help us better understand and do our jobs better?
That's a great question. And in part, actually, I would say I'd like to hear from folks on your end about how I and people like me can be helpful. But for example, I have spoken to gatherings of law enforcement officials, and my sense was just putting a face on it and hearing directly what the experience is like is helpful. One thing I mentioned earlier, the importance of active shooter training, that's very important. And I have tried to lend my voice to that, as have other survivors as well. And then speaking to people about hate and the consequences of hate. We can only speak in our own voices and what happened to us as a result of anti-Jewish hate. But I think people learning about that can learn important things about the nature of hate and the consequences of that hate more broadly. So the family members of the victims and the survivors have formed a group, and we've been going around speaking mainly to school groups. For example, I think a week or so ago, I and other folks went to Quaker Valley High School here in the Pittsburgh area. And then there's a number of other places people are going over the next couple of months. And the students see a relatively short clip from a film. There were some films made about what happened here. And then they have an assembly and we talk to them. And particularly having the opportunity to engage with young people is important. I'm not saying that people who are adults can't adapt or change. We do, but young people are particularly impressionable, both for good and for ill. I think young people can be very susceptible. There's a lot of stuff out there in social media and the internet, and some of that, as we know, is just terrible, terrible stuff. But we can warn them about that, and we can also try and make a positive impression on them to be more mindful of what they do, what they say, how they treat people, that even small things can make a difference. Look, for any one of us to change things, am I going to do something, and however much longer I have on this earth, that will eradicate hate? No, that's not going to happen. It's a wonderful aspirational goal to say, let's eradicate hate. But can I or any individual do small things, ideally on a daily basis, and just make the world a little bit more decent, kinder place for the short time we have in it? Yes, we can do that. And if I can do that, I'll be happy. I'll feel like I've done what I was put on this earth to do. If I can do more than that, so much the better. But talking to people, addressing them, is something that I feel we can do because we can speak from our own experiences and hopefully then for people illuminate the larger set of issues.
I'd like to ask both of you for your thoughts. We're in an R1 research university. This is what we do at Carnegie Mellon University, and also we're a partnership with the University of Pittsburgh, as you know. What are some thoughts that either of you have about research that could help us better understand targeted violence? What do you think are some opportunities from a research standpoint?
I don't pretend to be an academic. I got to this role by being a neighbor and community member with a mental health background. So I will say, take that with a grain of salt. I think that one of the things, though, that Marty just brought up that I would stress is that I think sometimes research has gotten too far from humaning. I think that actually doing more coupling of hearing from victims, if it was related to anti-Semitism, of course, people from our community, but there's people who have been victimized for many reasons. And I think research is better served if you ask and listen to human experiences. And it's not just for the benefit of what the research might show, but I actually would say that for researchers, it's a way to make the work so much more meaningful. And it allows you to ask questions very differently when you know and care and can hear from the lived experience of other people. I think that research has to be curious about how do we stop separating into these two extremes. That is really one of the learnings that I had, was that it's dialogue will always keep us safer, and the less we're talking because we're instead just shouting from different spaces. So we have to be doing research about what it is to bring back curiosity, to decrease the polarization of people, if we want to prevent hate-fueled violence. The other area that we've learned more from our partners at the FBI about prevention is around grievance narratives. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in the research areas of why do people develop grievance narratives? What makes people feel so alienated? How do you prevent them from doing that earlier? They often talk about that being the upstream effects. How can you get upstream for somebody who feels so alienated by having people be part of things, part of religious communities, part of sports communities, part of school communities, part of neighborhood communities? Any community is prevention of acting in a way that that will harm other people so senselessly. So those are some of my feelings of where research needs to go. But again, I think there's a lot of things I don't know. So
thanks, Maggie. And so I am a researcher. That's my day job. So let me say a few things. There is a tendency among academics to operate where the rubber meets the sky, as one of my colleagues say. But here, I think this effort really, really needs to be conscious of and focus on being where the rubber meets the road. So I'm really grateful you reached out to us and are meeting with us. But to my knowledge, this research center has had no engagement whatsoever with the community or with the survivors or victims, even though, of course, I'm right here on campus. I did reach out to previous and current directors, and I was pretty much ignored, even though the center has been in existence for some time. And I say that not as a grievance, but just, I think, to emphasize what Maggie said, I personally think that it's important for not just the leadership of this center, but for the faculty, the students, whoever's involved, to hear and meet with people who have been directly affected by violence. I'm not saying not just me or the other folks affected by 10/27/18. There, again, are unfortunately many more people. But I think to really understand what's happening and the impacts, I don't think there's any substitute for that. So I think that's an important component that, to my knowledge, has been absent to this point from the CMU Pitt Research Center. And then I think really thinking hard about focusing on research that will have direct, practical, usable impacts. That's not always the incentive in the academic world, I know, because this is where I live. And we do sometimes honestly operate where the rubber meets the sky. Some of that can still be valuable and useful stuff, but that's not what we're talking about here. There is a tendency among researchers like other people to get excited by the topic of the moment, particularly if there's a lot of funding attached to it. And in my view, that's not what you want. You don't want people who are chasing the latest bright, shiny object. You don't want people who just want to get another grant or their lab funded or some of their time bought off. You want people who really are in this because they want to make a difference. And it doesn't really matter to them whether this gets published in the most prestigious place possible where they win an academic prize or not. What they care about is making a difference. And I think that I'm not saying the center has not done this. I honestly don't know. But I think that is a very, very important aspect. Now, that is part of the culture of Carnegie Mellon, right? Andrew Carnegie, my heart is in the work. We're a very practical place. There's a tremendous amount of research that goes on here that results in very direct, tangible things that do matter and do make a difference in the real world. And I think tapping into that tradition here at Carnegie Mellon will make the activities of this research center really, really powerful and really important.
Thank you for sharing that, Marty. I think that's something we all needed to hear. And I will say that we've been trying to figure out who we are and where we want to focus. And that's where we've devoted the last, I would say, year and a half, trying to figure out how do we define ourselves. And to your point, we want to be about applied research, practical research that can be applied, where the rubber meets the road. And we want to be focused on targeted violence stemming from bias, communities that experience bias and hate. And so maybe this podcast is the beginning of something new. And I'm really excited to have both of you here. Thank you both so very much.
Thank
really
you.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Marty, for being here with me.